This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi.
It all started with a letter, a crumpled, handwritten note from an Indiana prison cell that claimed to hold the truth about one of the most haunting murder cases in recent history. A case that has seemed all but closed, unless you're paying attention, like we are here, and you are out there. The Delphi murders. For years, the world believed it had its right answer. Richard Allen, a quiet, seemingly unremarkable pharmacy worker, was arrested, charged, and convicted in late 2024 for the brutal slayings of 14-year-old Libby German and 13-year-old Abby Williams. A case that took over half a decade to crack. An investigation that led to dead ends, twists, online speculation, and conspiracy theories, only to land on a single man. But then came the letters. Ricci Davis, an inmate at Newcastle Correctional Facility, was serving time on unrelated charges when he decided to upend the official story. He didn't just have a theory, he had a confession. One he claimed to have heard firsthand from a man long suspected of involvement but never charged, Ron Logan. And if what Davis wrote was true, then Richard Allen wasn't the real killer. Davis wasn't just another guy in prison looking for attention. He wasn't some amateur sleuth or crime junkie with too much time on his hands. He was an inmate who had spent years behind bars, and according to his letters, he had spoken directly with the man whose property became the scene of one of the most infamous investigations in the country. Ron Logan. Logan was the 77-year-old owner of that land where Libby and Abby were found murdered in 2017. He was questioned early in the investigation. His alibi, it didn't add up. His cell phone records put him near the scene at the time of the murders. The FBI even suspected him enough to raid his home. But then, nothing. No charges, no arrest. He died in 2022, leaving behind more questions than answers. Davis claimed Logan gave him these answers that he was looking for and that everyone was looking for in prison years earlier. According to Davis, Logan admitted outright to murdering Libby and Abby. He told Davis that he lured them into his property under the promise of showing them horses, something Logan was known for around town, allegedly. The girls, thinking they were in the presence of a friendly old man, followed him into the woods. What happened next, according to Davis's letter, was beyond horrific. Logan allegedly described in detail how he attacked the girls using a box cutter to kill them. He spoke about the details of the crime scene, details that Davis argued only the killer could know. More disturbingly, Logan claimed he wasn't alone. He hinted at two other people being involved in the crime, though Davis didn't say Logan specifically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If Logan truly confessed to Davis years before his death, why was this information never acted on? If the details he provided were so specific, why wasn't it ever a charge against him? And if Richard Allen was the real murderer, why did Logan allegedly say otherwise? And then the story gets even messier. Because according to Davis, another man started talking about the murders behind bars too, and his name was Kegan Kline. For those who don't remember, Kegan Kline is the notorious predator behind the Anthony Shots profile, an online alias used to catfish young girls, including Libby German, in the months leading up to the murders. His involvement in the case has always been murky. Investigators have never charged him with anything relating to the Delphi killings, but the connection between him and one of the victims has always fueled speculation, considering he was supposed to meet up with one of the girls the day they were murdered. Nothing to see here. Davis, however, claims Kline knew more than he let on. At some point in early 2024, Davis and Kline allegedly found themselves in the same prison unit. According to Davis, Kline sought him out, not the other way around. Kline allegedly asked if Logan had ever mentioned his name. It's an oddly specific question to ask if you had absolutely nothing to do with a crime. What followed, according to Davis, was a series of conversations where Kline reportedly corroborated aspects of Logan's confession. Davis's letter claims Kline admitted to knowing Logan and having shared child pornography with him on burner phones. He also allegedly referenced details of the Delphi murders that lined up with what Logan had said, reinforcing the idea that the two were somehow involved. And perhaps the most chilling part, Kline reportedly told Davis that he was relieved Richard Allen had been arrested because it meant that he wasn't. And this single statement flipped the case on its head. If Kline was telling the truth, if Logan was telling the truth, then Richard Allen had nothing to do with the murders. He was just a convenient suspect, a fall guy, for a crime that was still unsolved. Or at least that's what Davis wanted the world to believe. But here's where things took an even stranger turn. Davis didn't sit on this information. He tried to tell authorities. According to his letters, Davis wrote multiple times to Carroll County prosecutor Nicholas McClelland, outlining what Logan and Kline had confessed to. He detailed the alleged admissions, the crime scene specifics, the involvement of other people. He practically handed over a potential alternative suspect list on a silver platter. And what did he get in return? Silence. Davis claimed his letters were ignored. He even alleged that when he did manage to get a response, officials pressured him to simply and simplify his statements, to strip them down to something less detailed, something less problematic. You have 2 paragraphs, is what they said to him, allegedly. Tell us in 2 paragraphs what they said. Doesn't matter if there's more to it. We only want 2 paragraphs. You can't read more than that. Too busy. It didn't take a conspiracy theorist to see the implications. If Davis was telling the truth, if Logan really had confessed to him and named other potential accomplices, then why wasn't law enforcement acting on it? Why did it take a convicted felon sending out desperate letters to bring this information to light? Why wasn't this evidence presented at Richard Allen's trial? And why, after years of dead ends and unanswered questions, was this all being dismissed as unreliable hearsay? The defense finally got hold of the Davis letters in early 2025, long after Allen had been convicted. And when they did, they wasted no time bringing them into the spotlight, because if the prosecution knew about Logan's alleged confession and deliberately kept it from the defense, that wasn't just an oversight, that was suppression. That was potential misconduct. That could change everything. But the prosecution wasn't having any of it. When confronted with Davis's letters, Carroll County's lead prosecutor didn't hesitate to shut them down. Okay, he did wait a few days before saying anything at all. But when he did, he dismissed them as the ramblings of an untrustworthy inmate, a desperate attempt by a defense to introduce bold allegations that had no basis in fact. You know, like they've been saying to everything that has been thrown out there that really has a lot to it. His argument was simple. Ricci Davis was a convicted felon, a man with a long history of deception, had no credibility. His claims weren't supported by evidence, and most damning of all, he failed a polygraph test when questioned about these confessions. They shut it down immediately. To the prosecution, this wasn't some hidden truth finally emerging. It was just another baseless distraction, another dead-end theory cooked up by a guy who had nothing to lose. But the defense saw it a little differently. Because if the state knew about Logan's confession, if they ignored it, if they withheld it from trial, then what else were they hiding? And if the man allegedly sitting in prison wasn't the real killer, then who was? The moment the Ricci Davis letters came to light, the prosecution wasted no time shutting them down. The response was swift, almost aggressive, as if The very suggestion that someone other than Richard Allen could be responsible was an insult to their case, an insult to humanity even. Carroll County prosecutor Nicholas McClelland dismissed the letters outright, calling them unreliable and riddled with inconsistencies. In his words, they were nothing more than bold allegations made by an inmate with no credibility, an attention seeker throwing out wild claims to stir the pot. The strongest arguments from those letters, from the prosecution: Davis failed a polygraph test. According to McClelland, law enforcement had already investigated Davis's claims, and when they put him on a polygraph, he miserably failed. That's how they put it. Not just he failed, didn't pass, he miserably failed. Let's make it really dramatic, since we're talking about other people being really dramatic. That, to them, was enough to toss the whole thing to the trash. If Davis couldn't even pass a basic lie detector test, which are not admissible in court, why should they waste resources chasing down his claims? I don't know. Because his claims actually add up to a lot of other pieces of evidence out there in this case that seem to be conveniently ignored or not even brought in for consideration by a jury. Maybe there's something to them. Maybe you should take a closer look. But the dismissal went beyond just the polygraph. McClelland also pointed to the nature of jailhouse confessions and why they were inherently unreliable, which can be true. Over the years, courts have been flooded with prison informants who suddenly remember key details about major crimes, conveniently revealing bombshell evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, better living conditions, or just attention. And more often than not, these stories fall apart under scrutiny. A lot of them do. To McClelland, this was no different. A career criminal claiming that a now dead man admitted to murder? That wasn't evidence, that was hearsay. Worse, the details Davis provided weren't airtight. Some elements of his story contradicted official case findings. Keep in mind, though, some official case findings also contradict reality, too. That's another part of this. While others were just vague enough to be brushed aside as exaggerations or outright fabrications. This wasn't just about proving Davis was lying, though. The prosecution had no interest in entering an alternative suspect theory to begin with. Richard Allen had already been convicted. They weren't about to let a prison informant derail a case that had taken years to put together. The state's position was clear. The Delphi murders had been solved. Game over. There was no cover-up, no conspiracy, and certainly no reason to believe the words of an inmate with nothing to lose. But that response, no matter how forceful, didn't sit well with everyone, especially not the defense. The problem with the prosecution's argument wasn't just that they dismissed the letters. It's how they dismissed them so quickly. For years, the Delphi investigation was plagued with dead ends, shifting theories. Law enforcement had followed leads that seemed far more far-fetched than a property owner confessing to a fellow inmate. Yet now with a confession, one that allegedly included crime scene details only the killer would know, they weren't even considering the possibility? That to the defense, it just wasn't negligence. That right there was deliberate ignorance. Jailhouse confessions might not always hold up in court, but they're also not automatically false. Some of the biggest criminal cases in history have been cracked by inmates talking about things they shouldn't have known. The defense didn't expect the state to take Davis at his word, but they didn't expect just to have it all just dismissed and ignored completely. They did expect them to investigate it properly. And yet Davis claimed the prosecution never followed up. He had written multiple letters, each one detailing the same confession, each one ignored. The prosecution never called him for further questioning, never went back to re-examine old evidence in light of his claims, never even entertained the possibility that he was telling the truth. To the defense, this wasn't just an oversight, it was a Brady violation. In the legal world, a Brady violation happens when the prosecution withholds evidence that could be favorable to the defense. It's a big deal. If the state is sitting on something that might prove the defendant's innocence and fails to disclose it, it's not just unfair, it can be grounds for an appeal, even a retrial. And in the case of the Davis letters, the defense argued that's exactly what happened. The letters contained information, at the very least, that they should have been handed over to the defense before Richard Allen's trial if the prosecution had these letters in their possession, but chose not to disclose them. That meant Allen's attorneys never got the chance to argue their importance in court, which they've every right to do. They never got the chance to question Davis on the stand, to cross-examine his claims, or to explore whether Logan's confession might change the entire trajectory of the case. This wasn't just about giving the defense more ammo. This was about the right to a fair trial. And if the state had actively withheld evidence that suggested someone else was involved, then Allen's confession might not hold up under appeal. But the prosecution denied any wrongdoing. They argued the Davis letters were never legitimate evidence to begin with, so there was no obligation to hand them over because they deemed them not credible. If the information wasn't credible, they weren't legally required to disclose it. In their eyes, this wasn't suppression, it was filtering out noise. Kind of convenient when you're the one that gets to decide that, and the things you're filtering out just happen to benefit the defense. That, of course, begged the bigger question, was the state trying to protect its case or the truth? If the Ricci Davis letters had surfaced before Richard Allen's conviction, would the prosecution have reacted differently? That's what many critics of the case have been asking. Because when you step back, it sure looked like the state had every incentive to ignore anything and everything that contradicted their version of events. They'd spent years trying to crack the Delphi murders. The case had become a national obsession. The public was desperate for justice. When Richard Allen was arrested in 2022, it wasn't just a big moment, it was the moment. The moment when law enforcement could finally say, we got him. And once that moment happened, they couldn't afford to go backwards. By the time Davis's claims came out, the state had already built an airtight narrative around Allen, or so they thought. They had forensic evidence. A single unspent bullet allegedly linked to his gun that was never cycled through his gun. They had witness statements placing him near the crime scene. They had recordings of him making incriminating statements while in jail. After being tortured for years, which is how you get false confessions. The prosecution entertaining an alternative theory meant undoing everything they had made up. Worked for. Or tortured people for. Worked for. Because if Logan had confessed, if other people were involved, if Allen was actually innocent, they had spent years putting the wrong man behind bars and torturing him. And that doesn't sit well with people. It's not a good look. And that's not something a prosecutor ever wants to admit. So when faced with that possibility, the easiest path was to dismiss, discredit, and move on, which they continue to do. Ignore the letters. Call Davis a liar. Say the case was closed. And for now, that's exactly what they've done. But ignoring something, as we all know, doesn't make it go away. And the more people dig into the Davis letters, the more uncomfortable questions start to pile up. Because if the prosecution was so sure that they had the right man, if their case was so rock solid, then why did they seem so afraid of new information? And if they were so quick to dismiss Ricci Davis's claims as unreliable, then what else were they willing to ignore? Ron Logan was never officially charged in the Delphi murders, but his name has never really left the case. Even before Ricci Davis's letters threw him back into the spotlight, Logan was an early person of interest, maybe even the earliest. The man owned the land where Libby and Abby's bodies were found, which, from an investigative standpoint, put him under the automatic veil of scrutiny. His connection to the crime scene wasn't a coincidence, it was a flashing red light. And yet, despite a series of damning details, law enforcement never made the move to arrest him. Back in 2017, when the murders first happened, the FBI zeroed in on Logan almost immediately. There was enough suspicion to get a search warrant for his property, and the affidavit made it clear that the investigations weren't just looking, they were expecting to find something. The document mentioned how the girls' bodies appeared to have been moved and staged, suggesting that the killer had spent significant time at the scene. It also noted that the perpetrator likely would have been covered in blood, yet Logan never accounted for his whereabouts in a way that satisfied investigators. And then there was his alibi. Ron Logan told police that on the day of the murders, he had been far away from the crime scene, running errands in another town. When they dug into his story, the story that he made up before even anyone knew there were bodies out in his yard, it fell apart. His cell phone data placed him near the crime scene at a critical time. And they found out that he had asked a relative to lie for him. He'd arranged for someone to say they drove him somewhere else. In reality, they hadn't. The FBI called this an effort to deceive law enforcement, because it is. In simple terms, Logan knew he needed an alibi, and he tried to create one. That should have been enough to bring him in, right? But here's the catch. There was never enough forensic evidence to charge him, at least not according to the Delphi authorities. No DNA, no fingerprints, no smoking gun, just a shaky alibi. Proximity to the crime scene and a gut feeling from investigators that something wasn't right. For whatever reason, that wasn't enough. Law enforcement kept looking elsewhere, and Logan died in 2022 without ever being accused of actual involvement in the case itself. And then, years later, Ricci Davis's letters surfaced, painting Logan as the real killer. Suddenly, all those early suspicions came roaring back. The inconsistencies, the lies, the fact that the murders happened on his property. And now, according to Davis, Logan had outright confessed. That was enough to reignite the theory that maybe Logan wasn't just a person of interest after all. Maybe he was the person all along. But Logan wasn't the only name still floating around. If Logan's alleged confession was true, then the next question became, who were the other two people he claimed were involved? That's where the Kegan Kline connection and allegations get even messier. Kegan Kline's link to the Delphi murders has always been suspicious, but also frustratingly indirect. The guy was a known predator, someone who spent his time online catfishing young girls using fake models' photos under the screen name Anthony Schatz. That profile was later confirmed to have communicated with Libby German before the murder. Let that one sink in. That's just a random connection. This wasn't speculation, it was fact. Kline admitted it, but despite that connection, he was never charged in relation to the case. The issue? There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene. He was shady, he was manipulative, and he had every reason to want to lure young girls in. But there was nothing concrete that put him in Delphi that day. Still, the fact that his online persona had been in contact with Libby right before the murders, like meeting up, talking about meeting up with the girls who were murdered, the day they were murdered. Yeah, couldn't have anything to do with this. Clears, he checks out. He's got an alibi. Authorities questioned whether she had been lured under false pretenses. Was she expecting to meet someone she thought was a teenage boy, only to be confronted by something much, much worse? If so, was Kline just a digital middleman, or was he more involved than anyone actually realized? Ricci Davis's letters seemed to support the idea that Kline knew more than he let on. According to Davis, Kline was nervous about whether Logan had ever mentioned him. He supposedly asked Davis if his name had come up in their conversations, a weirdly specific question for someone who had nothing to do with the case. And Davis claimed that Kline had, in some form, confirmed aspects of Logan's story. That alone didn't prove Kline was directly involved in the murders, but it did suggest that Logan and Kline might have some kind of connection. And if Logan really was involved, the next logical question was, what role did Kline play? Of course, the defense had another theory entirely. The Odinist ritual murder theory was one of the most bizarre turns in the case, introduced by Richard Allen's attorneys in a last-ditch effort to steer the blame somewhere else. The claim that the murders were a pagan sacrifice carried out by a group of white supremacist Odinists. The defense pointed to support symbols at the crime scene, stick arrangements, and ritualistic formations, markings that they argued weren't random. They even suggested that investigators had been aware of this theory for years but refused to pursue it. The problem? The judge didn't buy it. Before the trial, the prosecution fought hard to block the Odinist theory from being presented in court, calling it outlandish and baseless. The judge agreed, ruling that the defense hadn't provided enough actual evidence to connect any known suspects to Odinism or ritual sacrifices. Even law enforcement, which had followed every imaginable lead in the case, publicly stated they found no evidence linking murders to any pagan group. And just like that, the Odinist angle was effectively dead. But with all these alternative theories still swirling, the legal battle for Richard Allen was far from over. His defense team immediately pushed for an appeal, arguing that the suppression of the Davis letters alone was enough to warrant a new trial. If the state had ignored a potential confession from Logan, if they had kept that information out of court, then Allen's conviction was built on incomplete evidence. That, they argued, was a miscarriage of justice. Whether or not Allen would actually get a new trial was another story. Appeals are notoriously difficult. The prosecution had already made it clear they consider the Davis letters worthless. But even if the courts didn't overturn Allen's conviction, the court of public opinion was another matter. As long as these questions remain unanswered in this case, as long as Logan's name kept coming up, as long as Kline was still lurking in the background, the case is not going to disappear. This is always something you look at where there's a possibility that law enforcement might reopen certain aspects of the investigation, especially if public pressure demanded it. Kind of doubtful in Delphi, but new witnesses could come forward. New forensic breakthroughs could happen. And with a case this big, one that had already taken so many unexpected turns, it was hard to rule anything out entirely. But one thing clear, the Delphi case wasn't as closed as the state wants people to believe. There are still too many holes, too many missing places, too many unanswered questions. And until those gaps are filled, the fight for justice or the real truth is far from over. And we'll keep covering it right here. Press subscribe so you don't miss any of our updates on this case. Wherever you're listening to this on the podcast platform, or if you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and please hit the subscribe button down there. We do greatly appreciate that. I'm Tony Bruschi. Stay with us.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast. She was a doting mother, the kind who baked cookies, made the best homemade Halloween costumes, and never missed a PTA meeting. The perfect mom. Until the police found something buried in the backyard, a secret she kept for years. A secret she thought would never come to light. The neighbors gasped. Not her. She's so nice. But people forget. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Some wear aprons. Some tuck their kids in at night. And some hide their darkest deeds in places they think no one will ever look. If only someone had heard the warning signs, had recognized the patterns from an eerily similar case on Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. If they had only subscribed to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts, they could have listened ad-free before anyone else and saved themselves from baking cookies with a serial killer. Instead, well, they won't be RSVPing to this year's PTA meeting. Subscribe now to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts.